I used to believe that family meant everything. That blood was thicker than water, that love conquered all the petty grievances and misunderstandings that crop up between people who share a name and a history. I held on to that belief for 73 years, through a marriage that lasted for decades until cancer took my beloved Margaret, through raising two children who I thought understood the values we tried to instill in them, through watching my daughter Sarah marry a man I had reservations about from the very beginning. I used to believe that family meant everything. That blood was thicker than water, that love conquered all the petty grievances and misunderstandings that crop up between people who share a name and a history. I held on to that belief for 73 years, through a marriage that lasted for decades until cancer took my beloved Margaret, through raising two children who I thought understood the values we tried to instill in them, through watching my daughter Sarah marry a man I had reservations about from the very beginning. Where in the world are you listening to this story right now? What time is it where you are? Whether it's your morning commute, your lunch break, or you're settling in for the evening, know that somewhere across the globe, others are hearing these same words, sharing this same moment of connection across time zones and continents. We're all part of this human experience, trying to make sense of family, loyalty, and what it means to be valued for who we really are. My name is Robert Chen, and I spent 45 years building a small manufacturing business from nothing into something substantial. Not flashy, not the kind of success that makes headlines, but steady and solid like the precision tools we produced for aerospace companies. I always believed in living modestly, in not flaunting whatever wealth I managed to accumulate. Margaret and I raised our children, Sarah and Michael, in a comfortable middle-class home, teaching them that money was a tool, not a trophy, and that respect was earned through character, not bank statements. After Margaret passed 3 years ago, I sold the business and settled into what I thought would be a peaceful retirement. I kept my routine simple: morning coffee while reading the newspaper, afternoon walks through the neighborhood where Margaret and I had lived for 30 years, evening phone calls with old friends who understood the particular loneliness of losing a spouse after so many shared decades. I had my health, my memories, and enough financial security to live comfortably without being a burden to anyone. Sarah visited regularly those first months after the funeral, bringing her husband David and their 2 teenage children. David had always been polite but distant, the kind of man who shook hands with careful precision and spoke in measured tones about safe topics like weather and traffic. He worked in finance, something involving investment portfolios and client relations, and he had a way of looking at me that made me feel like he was calculating something, though I could never quite put my finger on what. The first sign that something was changing came about 6 months ago, during one of their Sunday dinners. Sarah had been quieter than usual, picking at her food and glancing between David and me with an expression I couldn't read. The conversation had turned to my living situation, as it often did, with David suggesting perhaps it was time to consider something more manageable than the 4-bedroom house I'd shared with Margaret. "We were all here," David had said, his voice carrying that particular tone people use when they want to sound reasonable while saying unreasonable things. "The maintenance alone must be overwhelming for someone your age, Dad. And the isolation can't be good for you, rattling around in all that space by yourself." I remember setting down my fork and looking at him across the table, noting how he'd called me Dad with the same casual familiarity he might use to address a business colleague. Sarah was studying her plate as if the pattern of flowers around the rim held secrets she needed to decipher. The children were absorbed in their phones, as teenagers often are, oblivious to the undercurrents of adult conversation swirling around them. "I'm managing just fine," I told him, keeping my voice level and calm. "The house is paid for, the maintenance is minimal, and I have good neighbors who look out for each other. I'm not ready to make any major changes right now." David nodded with the kind of understanding that wasn't understanding at all. Of course. But we worry about you, don't we, Sarah? The logistics of everything, the paperwork, the financial management. It's a lot for anyone to handle alone, especially when grief can cloud judgment." That phrase stuck with me long after they left that evening. Grief can cloud judgment. As if my 45 years of successfully running a business, of making decisions that supported my family and employees, had somehow evaporated the moment Margaret drew her last breath. As if loving someone and missing them daily had rendered me incapable of paying bills or maintaining a household I'd managed for 3 decades. Over the following weeks, David's visits became more frequent, and his questions more specific. He wanted to know about my banking arrangements, my investment portfolio, whether I had proper legal documents in place. He spoke with the authority of someone who worked in finance, using phrases like fiduciary responsibility and asset protection that made simple concepts sound complicated and urgent. Sarah seemed to withdraw during these conversations, offering weak smiles and changing the subject when David's inquiries became too pointed. I began to sense that these visits weren't entirely spontaneous, that there were discussions happening between them that I wasn't privy to, plans being made that somehow centered on my life and choices. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. I was in my study, paying bills and organizing financial documents, when I heard the familiar sound of Sarah's car in the driveway. But instead of her usual cheerful call through the front door, I heard the sound of a key turning in the lock, followed by hushed voices in the foyer. I walked to the top of the stairs and saw David standing in my living room, surveying the space with the same calculating look I'd noticed before. He was speaking quietly into his phone, something about square footage and market conditions, while Sarah stood nearby looking uncomfortable and uncertain. When he noticed me on the stairs, David ended his call quickly and smiled with practiced warmth. "Robert, we were hoping to catch you. Sarah was worried about you, thought we should check in, make sure everything was okay." But I could see the real estate flyer folded in his jacket pocket, could sense the way he was measuring my home with his eyes, calculating not its value to me but its potential value to someone else. And I understood, with a clarity that cut through any lingering doubts, that my son-in-law had moved beyond suggesting changes to my life. He was actively planning them, with or without my consent. That night, as I sat in the chair where Margaret used to read her mystery novels, I realized that the family I thought I knew was already changing in ways I hadn't anticipated. The question was whether I would let them change me along with it, or whether I still had the strength to protect what mattered most, my independence, my dignity, and the life I'd built with my own hands and heart. The weeks following that Tuesday afternoon brought a subtle but persistent campaign of concern. David began calling regularly, ostensibly to check on my well-being, but his questions always circled back to practical matters. Had I remembered to pay the utilities? Was I keeping track of my medications? Did I need help organizing my financial documents? Each conversation carried the implication that I was struggling with tasks I'd managed competently for decades. Sarah's behavior became increasingly strained during these interactions. I could hear her in the background during David's calls, her voice a low murmur of what sounded like coaching or encouragement. When she visited alone, which happened less frequently now, she seemed nervous and distracted, unable to maintain the easy conversation we'd always shared. She would start sentences about her work or the children, then trail off as if she'd forgotten what she intended to say. I wonder how many of you listening have experienced this peculiar form of family concern, where love becomes indistinguishable from control, where those closest to you begin treating your independence as a problem to be solved rather than a right to be respected. It's a slow erosion that happens so gradually you might not notice until you're standing in your own kitchen, being asked if you're sure you can handle making coffee by yourself. David's visits became more frequent and more invasive. He would arrive unannounced, using Sarah's key, and find reasons to examine different areas of my home. He expressed concern about the steep staircase, the aging furnace, the potential safety hazards that apparently multiplied whenever he looked around. He brought pamphlets about senior living communities, spreading them across my dining room table like a real estate agent preparing a presentation. "Look at this place," he said during one particularly intrusive visit, gesturing toward a beautiful assisted living facility in the glossy brochures. "They handle all the maintenance, provide meals, organize activities. You'd have a community of people your own age, professional staff to help with anything you need. Wouldn't that be so much better than rattling around in this big empty house? I found myself defending choices I'd never questioned before. Explaining why I preferred cooking my own meals, why I enjoyed the responsibility of maintaining my home, why solitude wasn't the same as loneliness. But David had a way of nodding sympathetically while simultaneously dismissing everything I said, as if my preferences were symptoms of confusion rather than expressions of autonomy. The turning point came when I discovered he'd been going through my mail. I found him in my study one afternoon, sorting through bank statements and investment reports that I'd left on my desk. He looked up when I entered, showing no embarrassment at being caught examining my private financial information. "I was just trying to help organize things," he said, holding up a statement from my primary checking account. "This is exactly what I've been worried about, Robert. Look at this balance. You're keeping way too much money in a low-interest checking account. That's not smart financial planning for someone in your situation." He was right about the balance being substantial, but wrong about everything else. The money in that account represented my operating expenses, my emergency fund, my comfort zone. I had other investments, other accounts, other financial arrangements that provided security and growth, but I saw no reason to discuss my complete financial picture with someone who was already overstepping boundaries. "That's my business, David," I said, reaching for the statements. "I've been managing my finances successfully for longer than you've been alive. I think I can handle my own checking account." But he held on to the papers, studying them with the intensity of someone solving a complex puzzle. "This is exactly what I mean about judgment being clouded by grief. No financial advisor would recommend keeping this much liquid capital in a basic checking account. You're losing money every day through inflation and opportunity cost." His tone was patient, condescending, the voice of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. And I realized that somewhere along the way, David had stopped seeing me as Sarah's father and started seeing me as a problem to be managed, an asset to be optimized, a responsibility to be handled efficiently. Sarah appeared in the doorway, looking flustered and apologetic. "Dad, David was just trying to help. We've been so worried about you handling everything alone. Maybe it would be good to have someone with financial expertise take a look at your situation." The word situation struck me as particularly revealing. My life had become a situation in their minds, something requiring intervention and management. I was no longer Robert Chen, successful businessman and devoted father. I was a situation that needed to be resolved. That evening, after they left, I sat in my living room thinking about the trajectory of their concerns. It had started with gentle suggestions about my living arrangements, escalated to uninvited visits and unsolicited advice, and now progressed to examining my private financial information without permission. I could see the pattern forming, could anticipate where this was heading if I didn't take action to protect myself. I walked to my home office and opened the safe where I kept my most important documents. Inside, along with my will and insurance policies, were records of financial accounts that David had never seen, investments he couldn't imagine, resources that represented decades of careful planning and conservative growth. I'd learned early in my business career that the most valuable assets were often the ones nobody knew about, the backup plans that provided security when primary strategies failed. As I reviewed these documents, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. Sadness that my own family had begun to see me as incapable and vulnerable, determination that I wouldn't allow their misconceptions to dictate my future. David might think he understood my financial situation based on one checking account statement, but he was about to learn that assumptions can be dangerous things, especially when they involve underestimating someone you've never bothered to truly know. The transformation in David's approach became unmistakable over the following month. What had begun as expressions of concern evolved into systematic attempts to gain control over my daily life. He started showing up with official-looking documents, speaking in legal terminology about power of attorney and financial guardianship, explaining how these arrangements would protect me from making costly mistakes in my advanced age. "I'm not that advanced," I reminded him during one particularly patronizing conversation. 73 isn't ancient, and my mind is as sharp as it's ever been. I've been making my own decisions for over 5 decades, and I'm perfectly capable of continuing to do so. But David had prepared for my resistance. He'd researched statistics about cognitive decline in elderly adults, printed articles about financial exploitation of seniors, compiled a portfolio of evidence that painted aging as an inevitable slide toward incapacity. He presented this information with the detached professionalism of someone building a legal case, which I was beginning to suspect he actually was. Sarah's role in these conversations became increasingly uncomfortable to witness. She would sit beside David, nodding at appropriate intervals, but her eyes held a sadness that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the direction their campaign was taking. When I tried to speak privately with her, she deflected my concerns with vague reassurances about everyone wanting what was best for me. The situation escalated when David began involving other family members in his narrative of concern. My son Michael, who lived across the country and rarely visited, started receiving regular updates about my supposed deteriorating condition. David painted a picture of dangerous forgetfulness, risky financial decisions, and stubborn refusal to accept reasonable help. Michael, busy with his own career and family, apparently accepted these reports without question. During one particularly painful phone call, Michael expressed his support for whatever David thought was necessary. "Dad, if David thinks you need help managing things, maybe you should listen to him. He knows about finance, and we're all just worried about you. None of us wants to see you taken advantage of or making mistakes that could hurt you." The irony wasn't lost on me. My own son was worried about me being taken advantage of, while supporting the very person who was systematically working to gain control over my life and assets. David had effectively isolated me from family support by positioning himself as the responsible party looking out for my interests. But David's most audacious move came when he suggested I should consolidate my banking for simplicity and security. He had researched financial institutions that specialized in serving seniors, he explained, places that understood the unique needs of elderly clients and provided additional protections against fraud and confusion. He could help me transfer my accounts to these specialized banks, where trained professionals would monitor my transactions and ensure I wasn't making impulsive or unwise financial decisions. The proposal was presented as a gift, a service he was offering to perform out of love and concern. But I recognized it for what it really was, an attempt to gain visibility and potential control over my finances by moving them to institutions where he might be able to position himself as a concerned family member authorized to monitor my activities. I declined his offer firmly, but David persisted with the patient determination of someone who believed he was saving me from myself. He brought Sarah into the conversation, encouraging her to express her concerns about my financial security and emotional well-being. She did so reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the words coming from her mouth, but unable or unwilling to openly oppose her husband's campaign. The breaking point came when I discovered David had been photographing documents in my study. I found him there one afternoon, using his phone to capture images of bank statements, investment reports, and insurance policies. When I confronted him, he showed no shame or embarrassment, simply explained that he was documenting my financial situation for my own protection. "Someone needs to have a record of these things," he said, continuing to photograph sensitive documents even as I demanded he stop. "What if something happens to you? What if you forget where you put important papers? Sarah and I need to know what accounts exist, what assets need to be protected, what obligations need to be met." I realized then that David's concern for my well-being was inseparable from his interest in my assets. He wasn't trying to protect me from financial harm, he was conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about resources he believed should be under family management. The distinction between caring for someone and taking control of their life had become completely blurred in his mind. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. I called my attorney, Harold Brennan, who had handled legal matters for my business and personal affairs for over 20 years. I explained the situation carefully, describing David's increasingly aggressive attempts to gain access to my finances and decision-making authority. Harold listened without interruption, then asked a series of pointed questions about my mental capacity, my ability to manage my affairs, and my concerns about family pressure. His questions were thorough but respectful, designed to protect both my interests and his professional obligations. Based on our conversation, Harold recommended several immediate steps to protect my autonomy and assets. He suggested updating my estate planning documents to ensure my wishes were clearly documented, establishing additional safeguards around my financial accounts, and creating a paper trail that demonstrated my continued competency and independent decision-making. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that I had taken action to protect myself, sadness that such protection had become necessary within my own family. David's campaign of concern had forced me to treat my daughter and son-in-law as potential threats rather than trusted allies, a shift that went against everything I believed about family loyalty and mutual support. But I was beginning to understand that David's version of family loyalty was a one-way street, where my obligations to trust and comply were absolute, while his obligations to respect and honor my autonomy were negotiable. The game he was playing had rules I was only beginning to comprehend, but I was learning quickly that the stakes were higher than I'd initially realized. The theft happened on a Thursday morning in December, 3 days before Christmas. I had been in the kitchen preparing my usual breakfast when I heard Sarah's key in the front door, followed by familiar voices in the hallway. David was explaining something to her in hushed tones, his words too quiet for me to understand but his tone urgent and determined. When I emerged from the kitchen, I found them standing in my living room with the forced casualness of people who had been caught in the middle of something they didn't want to explain. Sarah smiled with nervous brightness, asking about my plans for the holiday, while David examined the family photographs on my mantelpiece with studied interest. "We were thinking about Christmas dinner," Sarah said, her voice pitched higher than usual. "Maybe this year you could come to our house instead of hosting. It would be easier for everyone, and you wouldn't have to worry about all the preparation and cleanup." I had hosted Christmas dinner for 23 years, ever since Margaret and I had moved into this house. It was a tradition I treasured, a way of maintaining continuity and connection with family memories. The suggestion that it had become too burdensome for me felt like another small erasure of my independence and capabilities. While we talked, David excused himself to use the restroom, disappearing upstairs for what seemed like an unusually long time. I thought nothing of it at the moment, focused on defending my Christmas hosting traditions to Sarah, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the conversation we were having. It wasn't until that evening, when I sat down to pay some bills, that I discovered my primary checkbook was missing from the desk drawer where I always kept it. I searched methodically through every drawer, every shelf, every possible location where I might have misplaced it. But I knew with growing certainty that I hadn't misplaced anything. The checkbook had been taken. I called Sarah immediately, keeping my voice calm and measured despite the anger building in my chest. I explained that some important items were missing from my study and asked if she or David had noticed anything unusual during their visit. Sarah's response confirmed my worst suspicions. She became flustered, speaking too quickly, offering explanations that made no sense. "Maybe you moved it somewhere else and forgot," she suggested. "Or maybe it fell behind the desk. These things happen, Dad. I'm sure it will turn up." But her voice carried the strain of someone trying to convince herself as much as me. I could hear David in the background, coaching her responses, telling her what to say. The realization that my own daughter was participating in this deception, however reluctantly, cut deeper than the theft itself. The next morning, I drove to my bank and explained the situation to Janet Morrison, the branch manager who had handled my accounts for over 15 years. Janet knew me well enough to understand that I wasn't a confused elderly man misplacing important documents. She immediately froze the compromised account and helped me establish new security protocols for all my banking relationships. While we worked through the protective measures, Janet mentioned something that chilled me to the bone. Someone had called the bank 2 days earlier, claiming to be my son-in-law and expressing concern about unusual activity on my account. The caller had requested information about my recent transactions and account balances, claiming he was helping me manage my finances due to my declining mental capacity. Janet had properly refused to provide any information without my explicit authorization, but the attempt revealed the scope of David's campaign. He wasn't just stealing my checkbook, he was actively working to gain unauthorized access to my financial information through manipulation and deception. That afternoon, I received a call from David himself. His voice carried a tone of manufactured concern as he explained that he'd heard about my missing checkbook and wanted to offer his assistance in resolving the situation. He could help me contact the bank, he said, could speak to them on my behalf to ensure all necessary precautions were taken. The audacity was breathtaking. The man who had stolen my checkbook was now offering to help me deal with its disappearance, positioning himself as the responsible family member stepping in to assist a confused elderly relative. He spoke with such practiced sincerity that I might have believed him if I hadn't known the truth. I listened to his entire offer of assistance, letting him elaborate on how he could protect me from potential financial harm, how his expertise in banking and investment management made him uniquely qualified to handle this crisis. Then I told him, very quietly, that I knew exactly what had happened to my checkbook and exactly who was responsible. The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds. When David finally spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of concern and taken on the cold calculation I'd glimpsed during our previous confrontations. He didn't deny the theft. Instead, he began explaining why it had been necessary. "Robert, you're not thinking clearly about this situation. The amount of money you're keeping in that account is dangerous. You're a target for scammers, for people who would take advantage of your age and isolation. Sarah and I are trying to protect you from making costly mistakes, but you won't listen to reason." His justification revealed everything I needed to know about how he viewed me and my rights. In David's mind, my refusal to accept his financial management constituted evidence of incompetence. My insistence on maintaining control over my own money proved that I couldn't be trusted with my own money. The circular logic would have been amusing if it weren't so dangerous. I hung up the phone without responding to his rationalization. There was nothing to discuss, nothing to negotiate. David had crossed a line from manipulation into outright theft, and he'd done so with the confidence of someone who believed his victim was powerless to respond effectively. But as I sat in my study that evening, surrounded by the financial documents David had never seen, I felt a grim satisfaction knowing how wrong he was about my powerlessness. The checking account he'd targeted represented less than 2% of my total assets. The real wealth, the resources that could change lives and reshape futures, remained completely hidden from his calculating gaze. David had stolen my checkbook assuming I was defenseless, but he was about to learn that assumptions can be very expensive mistakes. The game he thought he was winning was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate, and the elderly man he'd underestimated was about to demonstrate exactly how dangerous it could be to mistake patience for weakness. The week following the theft brought a coordinated assault on my independence that revealed just how carefully David had planned his campaign. Within days of our confrontation, I received calls from my son Michael, my sister Eleanor, and even neighbors who had been contacted by concerned family members worried about my mental state and living situation. David had crafted a narrative that painted me as an increasingly confused elderly man who was becoming paranoid and irrational. According to his version of events, I was making wild accusations against family members who were only trying to help, refusing reasonable assistance with financial management, and showing signs of the kind of cognitive decline that required immediate intervention. The story was believable precisely because it contained enough truth to seem credible. I was indeed resisting their help, I was making accusations against David, and I was refusing to accept their version of what was reasonable. But David had skillfully omitted the context that explained my resistance, his unauthorized access to my private documents, his attempts to manipulate bank officials, and his outright theft of my financial instruments. Michael called from Seattle, his voice heavy with reluctant authority. "Dad, I've been talking with David and Sarah, and I think we need to have a serious conversation about your situation. They're really worried about you, and frankly, some of the things they're telling me are concerning. This paranoia about David trying to steal from you doesn't sound like the rational father I've always known." The conversation was devastating not because of what Michael said, but because of what he didn't say. He never asked for my side of the story, never questioned David's version of events, never considered that his brother-in-law might have motivations beyond pure concern for my welfare. David had successfully positioned himself as the reliable narrator while casting me as an unreliable witness to my own life. If you're listening to this story during a difficult time in your own life, whether it's dawn where you are or the middle of the night, know that isolation can happen to anyone, at any age, when those closest to us choose to believe convenient lies rather than uncomfortable truths. The loneliness of being disbelieved by your own children is something that transcends time zones and circumstances. Sarah's betrayal cut deepest because it was the most reluctant and therefore the most painful to witness. When she visited 3 days after Christmas, she could barely meet my eyes as she delivered what was clearly a rehearsed speech about family concern and necessary interventions. Her hands shook as she placed brochures for assisted living facilities on my coffee table, her voice breaking as she explained how these places would provide the structure and security I apparently needed. "Dad, we can't watch you struggle like this anymore," she said, tears streaming down her face. The confusion, the accusations, the inability to manage basic financial responsibilities. "We love you too much to let you hurt yourself through poor decisions and paranoid thinking." It was masterfully orchestrated. David had positioned himself as the rational authority figure while allowing Sarah to be the emotional messenger, the grieving daughter forced to make difficult decisions about her deteriorating father. Anyone witnessing this scene would have seen a loving family struggling with the heartbreak of aging and decline, not a calculated theft disguised as intervention. But I knew the truth, and I had evidence David wasn't aware I possessed. The security cameras I'd installed around my property 6 months earlier had captured his theft of my checkbook, his unauthorized photography of financial documents, and several other invasive actions he'd taken when he thought he was unobserved. I had also documented every attempt he'd made to gain unauthorized access to my banking information, every manipulation of family members, every lie he'd told to support his narrative of my incompetence. The final blow came when David presented legal documents that would grant him temporary financial power of attorney, ostensibly to protect my assets while the family worked through this difficult period. The papers were professionally prepared, complete with citations of legal precedents for emergency intervention in cases of suspected cognitive decline. He had clearly invested significant time and money in building a legal framework for his takeover of my financial affairs. "I'm not signing anything," I told him, pushing the documents back across my dining room table. "And if you continue this campaign of harassment and theft, I'll be forced to take legal action to protect myself." David's response revealed the confidence he felt in his position. "Robert, that kind of paranoid thinking is exactly why these measures are necessary. No one is trying to hurt you or take advantage of you. We're trying to protect you from the kind of poor judgment that could destroy everything you and Margaret worked so hard to build." He gestured toward Sarah, who was sobbing quietly in the corner of the room, her distress apparently validating his concerns about my unreasonable behavior. "Look what you're putting your daughter through with these wild accusations and stubborn refusal to accept help. Is this really the legacy you want to leave, driving away the people who love you most?" That night, alone in the house that had been my sanctuary for 3 decades, I reached my lowest point. My children believed I was losing my mind, my neighbors had been told I was becoming dangerous and unpredictable, and the man who had stolen from me was positioning himself as my protector. The isolation was complete, the narrative was established, and David's victory seemed inevitable. But as I sat in my study, looking at the documents David had never seen, I reminded myself that appearances could be deceiving. David thought he understood my financial situation based on one checking account, thought he could control my future by manipulating my present circumstances. He had no idea that the resources at my disposal could not only protect me from his schemes but could fundamentally alter the balance of power in ways that would shock everyone involved. The old man he thought he was victimizing had spent 45 years building something much larger and more sophisticated than a simple retirement account. And tomorrow, I would begin the process of showing him exactly how expensive it could be to underestimate someone based on age, assumptions, and incomplete information. The game was about to change, and David had no idea what was coming. The turning point came through an unexpected ally. Harold Brennan, my attorney, had been conducting his own quiet investigation into David's activities since our last conversation. When he called me the morning after that devastating confrontation, his voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had uncovered important information. "Robert, I've been making some inquiries about your son-in-law's professional background and recent activities. There are some things you need to know that might change how you approach this situation." Harold's research had revealed that David's financial expertise was less impressive than he'd claimed. His investment firm was struggling, and he'd recently been placed on administrative review for questionable client recommendations that had resulted in significant losses. Several clients were considering legal action, and David's professional reputation was hanging by a thread that could snap at any moment. More importantly, Harold had discovered that David had been researching legal procedures for establishing financial guardianship over elderly relatives. He'd consulted with attorneys about the process, downloaded forms for competency evaluations, and even made preliminary inquiries about having me declared mentally incompetent for financial decision-making purposes. This wasn't a family intervention motivated by love and concern. This was a calculated business plan to gain control over assets David believed would solve his own financial problems. The theft of my checkbook wasn't an isolated incident, it was a test run for a much larger operation. I wonder how many of you listening have experienced the moment when someone you trusted reveals themselves to be something entirely different than what you believed them to be. Whether you're hearing this during your morning routine or late at night when the world is quiet, know that these revelations of betrayal are among the most disorienting experiences we can face as human beings. Harold's information gave me the clarity I needed to move from defensive protection to strategic action. David thought he was playing a game where I was an unknowing victim, but he was about to discover that I'd been aware of his moves all along and had been preparing countermoves he couldn't anticipate. My first call was to Patricia Wong, my private wealth manager who handled investments that didn't appear on any documents David had access to. Patricia had been managing portions of my portfolio for over 20 years, overseeing accounts in jurisdictions that provided both growth opportunities and privacy protections. Our relationship was built on discretion and trust, qualities that had served me well in business and were about to prove invaluable in this personal crisis. "Robert," Patricia said when I explained the situation, "I've been waiting for this call. When you first established these accounts, you mentioned wanting to protect your assets from potential family disputes. It sounds like that foresight was more valuable than you realized at the time." The numbers Patricia reviewed with me were staggering even to someone who had built this wealth gradually over decades. The offshore accounts, international investments, and protected trusts represented resources that dwarfed anything David had imagined possible. The checking account he'd targeted contained less than 2% of my total liquid assets, and the liquid assets themselves were only a fraction of my complete financial picture. But more important than the money was the infrastructure I'd built around it. legal protections that would take years to penetrate, investment vehicles that provided both security and flexibility, professional relationships that could mobilize resources quickly and discreetly. David had been playing checkers while I'd been positioned for chess, and he was about to learn the difference between those two games. My second call was to James Morrison, a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud and family exploitation cases. James had helped me with background checks on potential business partners over the years, and his skills were perfectly suited to documenting David's campaign of manipulation and theft. Within 48 hours, James had assembled a comprehensive file of David's activities. Security footage from my property showing unauthorized access and theft. Phone records documenting his attempts to manipulate bank officials. Written communications proving his coordination with other family members to build the narrative of my incompetence. Financial records revealing his own desperate circumstances and motivation for targeting my assets. The evidence was overwhelming and professionally documented, the kind of material that would be admissible in court and devastating to David's carefully constructed image of concerned family member acting in my best interests. But I wasn't interested in simply defending myself or proving David wrong. I wanted to demonstrate the cost of underestimating someone based on age and assumptions, to show him exactly what kind of resources and capabilities he'd chosen to attack. The lesson needed to be memorable enough that he would never again mistake patience for weakness or kindness for vulnerability. Harold helped me craft a strategy that would reveal David's true situation while simultaneously exposing my actual capabilities. We would use his own methods against him, his reliance on appearances and assumptions, his belief that he understood the complete picture based on incomplete information. The plan required precise timing and careful coordination, but it would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. It would protect my autonomy and assets, demonstrate to my family that I was far from the confused victim they'd been told to expect, and provide David with their education about the dangers of targeting the wrong person. As I reviewed the strategy with Harold and Patricia, I felt a mixture of sadness and anticipation. Sadness that family relationships had deteriorated to the point where such measures were necessary, anticipation for the moment when David would realize how completely he'd misunderstood the situation he'd created. The old man he thought he was manipulating was about to remind him that age and experience could be far more dangerous than youth and arrogance, especially when combined with resources he'd never imagined and professional relationships he'd never suspected. David had started a game he wasn't equipped to finish, and the consequences were about to exceed anything he'd prepared for. Tomorrow would begin the most expensive education of his life, and I would be his very thorough teacher. The preparation phase required surgical precision and absolute discretion. Over the next week, while David continued his campaign to have me declared incompetent, I quietly assembled the resources that would demonstrate exactly how competent I remained. The irony wasn't lost on me that as he worked to prove my mental decline, I was orchestrating a response that required strategic thinking he couldn't match. Patricia arranged for discreet transfers from overseas accounts, moving funds through established channels that left clear documentation trails. These weren't my primary assets being repositioned, merely working capital that would be sufficient to handle the immediate situation. The amounts involved were larger than David's annual income, yet represented less than my quarterly dividend payments from international investments. James Morrison's investigation had expanded beyond documenting David's theft to examining his complete financial picture. The results painted a portrait of a man whose desperation ran much deeper than I'd initially realized. David's investment firm was facing regulatory investigation, his personal debts exceeded his assets by a substantial margin, and he'd been using client funds to cover operational expenses in what amounted to a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. His targeting of my assets wasn't opportunistic, it was essential to his survival. Without access to significant capital in the immediate future, David faced professional ruin, criminal prosecution, and financial devastation. My checking account had been a down payment on what he hoped would be complete control over what he believed was my modest retirement nest egg. Sometimes when you're facing a challenge, whether it's during your morning commute or a sleepless night when problems feel overwhelming, you discover that the strength to fight back comes not from anger but from a deep understanding of what you're truly protecting. For those of you listening who have felt underestimated or dismissed because of your age, know that experience and patience can be the most powerful weapons in your arsenal. Harold coordinated with law enforcement officials who specialized in elder financial abuse, briefing them on David's systematic campaign and providing the documented evidence James had assembled. The investigators were particularly interested in David's attempts to manipulate banking officials and his research into guardianship procedures, both of which elevated his actions from family disputes to potential criminal fraud. But the most satisfying element of our preparation involved David's own professional network. Patricia's contacts in the financial industry had quietly spread word about David's precarious situation, his desperate need for capital, and his questionable ethics in pursuing family assets. The professional community that David relied on for his reputation and client base was already beginning to distance themselves from potential scandal. My strategy wasn't simply to defend against David's attacks or even to expose his criminal behavior. I wanted to demonstrate the fundamental error in his assumptions about who he'd chosen to target. The confused, vulnerable elderly man he thought he was manipulating needed to be revealed as someone with resources, connections, and capabilities that dwarfed anything in David's experience. The centerpiece of our response was a carefully orchestrated revelation that would shatter David's narrative while simultaneously protecting my family from his manipulation. We would use his own scheduled intervention meeting, the family gathering he'd arranged to formalize his financial control over my affairs, as the stage for his education about the reality of my situation. David had sent formal invitations to family members for what he called a necessary discussion about my care and financial management. Sarah, Michael, my sister Eleanor, and even some of my grandchildren were expected to attend this intervention where David would present his evidence of my incompetence and propose his solutions for protecting my assets and well-being. Harold suggested we let the meeting proceed as David had planned, allowing him to present his case completely before revealing the actual facts about my financial situation and his criminal activities. The contrast between David's assumptions and the reality would be devastating to his credibility and authority. Patricia arranged for a comprehensive financial disclosure that would be presented during the meeting, complete with documentation of offshore accounts, international investments, and trust arrangements that David had never suspected existed. The presentation would be delivered by representatives from my Swiss banking partners, my Cayman Islands wealth management team, and my London-based legal advisors, all appearing via secure video conference to confirm the scope and security of my financial arrangements. The numbers alone would be shocking enough to silence any discussion about my need for financial assistance or oversight. But the professional infrastructure surrounding these assets, the international legal protections, and the sophisticated management strategies would demonstrate a level of financial sophistication that made David's expertise look amateurish by comparison. James had prepared a secondary presentation documenting David's criminal activities, his desperate financial situation, and his systematic campaign to gain control over my assets through fraud and manipulation. This evidence would be presented to law enforcement officials who would be standing by to take appropriate action based on the family's reaction to these revelations. The final element of our strategy involved Sarah specifically. Harold had prepared a separate briefing for her that would occur after David's exposure but before any legal proceedings began. We wanted to give her the opportunity to understand how she'd been manipulated and used in David's scheme, to recognize that her father's supposed decline had been fabricated to serve her husband's criminal purposes. As the day of David's planned intervention approached, I felt a calm determination that reminded me of the most challenging business negotiations I'd handled over the decades. The preparation was complete, the resources were positioned, and the strategy was designed to achieve maximum impact with minimum collateral damage to innocent family members. David thought he was orchestrating my surrender, but he was actually arranging his own destruction. The meeting he'd planned as my defeat would become his comprehensive education about the cost of underestimating someone based on age, assumptions, and incomplete information. The elderly victim he thought he was controlling was about to demonstrate exactly what 45 years of business success and strategic thinking could accomplish when properly motivated. The morning of David's intervention arrived with January snow blanketing the neighborhood where Margaret and I had shared so many peaceful winters. As I prepared coffee and reviewed my notes one final time, I felt the peculiar calm that comes from knowing you've prepared thoroughly for a confrontation that will change everything. David thought this day would mark his victory over a confused old man, but he was about to receive the most expensive education of his life. By 10 o'clock, family members began arriving for what David had billed as a necessary discussion about my deteriorating condition and need for professional care management. Sarah came first, her face drawn with the strain of participating in what she believed was a loving intervention. Michael flew in from Seattle, clearly uncomfortable but convinced by David's narrative that drastic action was required to protect me from myself. Eleanor, my 70-year-old sister, arrived with the grim determination of someone prepared to make difficult decisions about a beloved brother who could no longer make rational choices. Even my teenage grandchildren were present, their expressions mixing confusion with the solemnity they'd been told the situation required. David had assembled quite an audience for what he expected to be my surrender. David himself arrived precisely at 11, carrying a leather portfolio containing the legal documents he intended to present for my signature. His confidence was evident in every gesture, from his firm handshake to his sympathetic smile as he surveyed the gathered family members. He moved through the room like a man who had already won, offering comfort to those he'd convinced were about to witness their patriarch's necessary but painful transition to supervised care. Harold Brennan arrived shortly after 11:30, introducing himself as my legal counsel and requesting permission to record the proceedings for documentation purposes. David seemed pleased by this development, apparently believing that official legal witness to my stubborn irrationality would strengthen his case for emergency intervention. The meeting began with David presenting his carefully constructed case. He spoke with the polished authority of a financial professional, outlining the evidence he'd gathered of my declining judgment, my paranoid accusations against family members, and my dangerous resistance to reasonable assistance with asset management. He painted a picture of an elderly man whose grief had evolved into confusion, whose independence had become dangerous isolation. Sarah nodded along with his presentation, tears streaming down her face as she watched what she believed was her father's dignified decline. Michael asked pointed questions about legal protections and medical evaluations, clearly wanting to ensure that any intervention was handled properly. Eleanor held my hand, whispering that she understood how difficult this must be but that everyone was acting out of love. When David reached the portion of his presentation dealing with financial concerns, he produced bank statements from my primary checking account, highlighting what he characterized as dangerous levels of liquid assets being maintained without professional oversight. He explained the risks elderly individuals faced from financial predators, the importance of consolidated asset management, and the legal frameworks available for protecting vulnerable seniors. Then he presented the power of attorney documents he wanted me to sign, explaining how these would protect my assets while ensuring I maintain dignity and autonomy within appropriate boundaries. The papers were professionally prepared, complete with witness requirements and notarization protocols. To everyone in the room except Harold and myself, they appeared to be reasonable protective measures proposed by a caring family member. I listened to David's entire presentation without interruption, watching him build his case with the confidence of someone who believed he controlled all the relevant information. When he finished and turned to me expectantly, I thanked him for his thoroughness and asked if I might respond to his concerns with some additional information the family should consider. Harold activated the video conference system we'd prepared, and the large television screen in my living room came alive with faces that clearly surprised everyone present. Patricia Wong appeared first, introducing herself as my private wealth manager and explaining that she'd been handling portions of my portfolio for over 20 years. Her professional credentials and calm authority immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. Patricia began with a simple statement that shattered David's foundation. The checking account David had been monitoring represented approximately 1.7% of my total liquid assets, she explained, and liquid assets themselves comprised roughly 15% of my complete financial portfolio. She then began presenting numbers that left the entire room in stunned silence. The offshore accounts Patricia managed contained more money than David earned in a decade. The international investments generated quarterly returns larger than most people's annual salaries. The trust arrangements and protected funds represented generational wealth that dwarfed anything David had imagined possible from a retired small business owner. But Patricia was just the beginning. Representatives from Swiss banking institutions, Cayman Islands wealth management firms, and London legal advisors appeared on screen in sequence, each confirming different aspects of my financial arrangements. They spoke about hedge fund investments, real estate portfolios, commodity holdings, and currency hedges with the casual professionalism of people managing truly significant wealth. The numbers kept growing, each revelation more stunning than the last. David's face had gone completely white, his confident posture collapsing as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. The elderly man he'd targeted for financial exploitation possessed resources that exceeded his wildest imagination, resources that were protected by legal and financial structures he couldn't begin to penetrate. Sarah was staring at the screen in shock, her understanding of her father's situation completely overturned. Michael was frantically taking notes, trying to process information that contradicted everything he'd been told about my declining capabilities. Eleanor was laughing through her tears, delighted by the revelation that her little brother had been far more successful than anyone realized. But the most satisfying moment came when Patricia addressed David directly. She explained that my financial advisors had been monitoring his attempts to gain unauthorized access to banking information, his research into guardianship procedures, and his systematic campaign to have me declared incompetent. They had documented everything, she said, and law enforcement officials specializing in elder financial abuse were standing by to take appropriate action. David tried to speak, to offer some explanation or justification, but Harold cut him off with a simple statement. The evidence of attempted financial fraud was overwhelming, he said, and the family would need to decide whether to pursue criminal prosecution or handle the matter through civil remedies. The intervention David had planned to establish his control over my finances had become his complete exposure and destruction. And we were just getting started. The silence that followed Patricia's revelations lasted nearly 2 full minutes. David sat frozen in his chair, the power of attorney documents scattered uselessly across the coffee table where they'd fallen from his trembling hands. His carefully constructed narrative had disintegrated so completely that he seemed unable to process what was happening around him. Sarah was the first to find her voice, turning to me with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Dad, I don't understand. Why didn't you ever tell us about any of this? All these years, we thought you were just getting by on your retirement savings and Social Security." I explained that Margaret and I had made a conscious decision to live modestly and raise our children without the complications that significant wealth could bring to family relationships. We wanted them to develop their own work ethic, their own sense of accomplishment, their own understanding of money's proper place in a meaningful life. The irony wasn't lost on me that our attempt to protect them from wealth's potential corrupting influence had created the very situation we'd hoped to avoid. Michael was staring at the financial documents Harold had distributed, trying to reconcile the numbers with everything he'd believed about his father's circumstances. "Dad, these investment returns alone are more than I make in 3 years. How long have you been managing this kind of portfolio?" I told him about the business decisions I'd made over the decades, the investments that had compounded quietly while I focused on running the manufacturing company, the international opportunities that had emerged as global markets expanded. Most importantly, I explained how I'd learned to protect and grow wealth through discretion, patience, and professional relationships built on trust rather than display. But David remained my primary concern. He was beginning to recover from his initial shock, and I could see him calculating furiously, trying to find some way to salvage his position or minimize the damage to his reputation and legal standing. His desperation was becoming more apparent by the minute, and desperate people often made dangerous decisions. Harold had anticipated this moment and smoothly transitioned the conversation to the evidence James Morrison had assembled about David's criminal activities. The private investigator appeared on screen via video conference, his presentation as methodical and devastating as Patricia's had been revelatory. James began with the security footage from my property, showing David's theft of my checkbook in clear, undeniable detail. The timestamp and multiple camera angles eliminated any possibility of misinterpretation or alternative explanation. David had been caught red-handed committing a felony, and the evidence was professionally documented and legally admissible. But the checkbook theft was only the beginning. James presented evidence of David's attempts to manipulate bank officials, his unauthorized research into my financial affairs, and his systematic campaign to convince family members that I was mentally incompetent. Each revelation built upon the previous one, creating a comprehensive picture of calculated fraud and manipulation. The most damaging evidence concerned David's own financial situation. James revealed the regulatory investigation into David's investment firm, the client lawsuits alleging fraudulent recommendations, and the sophisticated Ponzi scheme David had been operating to cover his losses. The family learned that David wasn't just a concerned son-in-law trying to help, he was a desperate criminal who had targeted my assets as his only hope of avoiding professional ruin and potential imprisonment. Eleanor gasped audibly when James presented evidence that David had been using client funds to pay personal expenses, had fabricated investment returns to hide losses, and had been planning to use my assets as collateral for business loans that would have left me financially exposed to his creditors. The scope of his deception extended far beyond family manipulation into serious financial crimes that affected multiple victims. Sarah's reaction was the most painful to witness. As the evidence mounted, she began to understand how thoroughly she'd been manipulated, how her love for her father had been weaponized against both of us. She looked at David with growing horror, recognizing that the man she'd married and trusted had been systematically lying to her about everything from his professional situation to his motives for targeting her father. "David," she whispered, her voice breaking. "How could you do this? How could you use me to hurt my own father? How could you lie about everything for so long?" David's response revealed the depth of his desperation and moral bankruptcy. He began making frantic justifications, claiming that everything he'd done was motivated by concern for the family's financial security. He argued that my refusal to share information about my assets had forced him to take protective action, that my apparent confusion and paranoia had left him no choice but to intervene decisively. But his arguments collapsed under the weight of the evidence. The security footage, financial records, and documented communications proved that his actions were motivated by personal desperation rather than family concern. His research into guardianship procedures had begun weeks before our first confrontation, his financial problems predated any concerns about my mental state, and his manipulation of family members was too systematic to be explained as emergency intervention. Harold allowed David to exhaust his explanations before presenting the final element of our response. Law enforcement officials specializing in elder financial abuse had reviewed all the evidence and were prepared to file criminal charges immediately. David faced potential prosecution for theft, fraud, attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person, and operating an unlicensed investment scheme. But I had one more surprise for David, one final demonstration of the resources he'd chosen to attack. Harold announced that my legal team had conducted a comprehensive investigation into David's business practices and had identified additional victims of his fraudulent investment scheme. We had already contacted these victims and their attorneys, providing them with evidence that would support their lawsuits and criminal complaints. David's professional destruction would be complete and public. His investment license would be revoked, his business would be shuttered, and his reputation would be permanently destroyed. The man who had targeted an elderly victim for easy money had chosen someone with the resources and connections to ensure that justice was both swift and comprehensive. As David finally began to understand the magnitude of his situation, his last vestige of composure crumbled completely. The confident authority figure who had opened the meeting was replaced by a desperate, cornered criminal who had realized too late that he'd made the most expensive mistake of his life. And I wasn't finished with his education yet. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and I could see in David's eyes that he finally understood the true scope of what he'd unleashed. His hands were shaking as he stared at the evidence spread across my coffee table, his breathing shallow and rapid like a cornered animal realizing there was no escape route. The confident manipulator who had entered my home that morning was gone, replaced by a desperate man facing the complete destruction of everything he'd built through lies and fraud. Harold cleared his throat and addressed the room with the formal authority of someone delivering a legal verdict. Based on the evidence presented today, we have sufficient grounds to pursue both criminal prosecution and civil remedies against David Chen for elder financial abuse, theft, fraud, and operating an unlicensed investment scheme. However, before we proceed with formal charges, Robert has asked for the opportunity to address David directly. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 73 years but also the strength that came from a lifetime of building something meaningful through honest work and careful planning. David couldn't meet my eyes as I approached his chair, his gaze fixed on the floor like a child caught in an unforgivable transgression. "David," I said, my voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent room. "6 months ago, you entered my life as my daughter's husband, someone I was prepared to welcome into our family despite my initial reservations. You had every opportunity to build a genuine relationship based on mutual respect and honest communication. Instead, you chose to see me as a target, an easy mark whose age and grief made me vulnerable to your schemes. For those of you listening to this story right now, whether you're facing your own moment of truth or supporting someone who is, remember that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about ensuring that the person who tried to harm you fully understands the consequences of their choices and the true nature of what they attempted to destroy." I continued my address to David, outlining each step of his campaign against me with clinical precision. I described how he'd researched legal procedures for establishing guardianship, how he'd manipulated my daughter's love for me into a weapon against both of us, how he'd stolen my checkbook while pretending to offer assistance and protection. I detailed his attempts to manipulate banking officials, his coordination with family members to build a narrative of my incompetence, and his systematic plan to gain control over assets he believed represented my complete financial picture. But most importantly, I explained the fundamental error in his approach. You assumed that because I was elderly and recently widowed, I must be vulnerable and defenseless. You mistook my modest lifestyle for limited resources, my discretion for confusion, my patience for weakness. You never considered that someone who had successfully built and operated a business for 45 years might have learned something about protecting assets, building professional relationships, and recognizing threats. Sarah was sobbing quietly in the corner, the full weight of her husband's betrayal finally becoming clear. Michael sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that his father possessed not only vast wealth but the sophisticated understanding necessary to protect it from exactly the kind of attack David had launched. Eleanor was shaking her head in amazement, proud of her brother's success but saddened by the circumstances that had forced its revelation. I returned to my chair and allowed Harold to present the final element of our response. David's criminal activities had already been reported to appropriate authorities, but the scope of our retaliation extended far beyond simple law enforcement action. Patricia had coordinated with international banking partners to ensure that David's financial crimes were documented across multiple jurisdictions, making it impossible for him to escape consequences by relocating or hiding assets. James Morrison had shared his evidence with regulatory bodies overseeing David's investment license, professional associations that governed his industry credentials, and law enforcement agencies investigating financial fraud. David's professional destruction would be complete and permanent, his ability to work in any capacity involving other people's money eliminated forever. But the most devastating consequence was yet to come. Harold announced that my legal team had prepared a comprehensive civil lawsuit seeking damages not only for David's theft and attempted fraud, but for the emotional distress he'd caused by manipulating my relationship with my children. The lawsuit would be filed in multiple jurisdictions and would seek assets sufficient to ensure that David never again possessed the resources necessary to harm other vulnerable individuals. The financial penalty alone would bankrupt David completely, but the public nature of the proceedings would ensure that his crimes became a matter of permanent record. Anyone who researched his background in the future would discover his systematic targeting of an elderly family member, his operation of fraudulent investment schemes, and his complete lack of professional integrity. David finally looked up at me, his face streaked with tears and his voice barely a whisper. "Robert, I'm sorry. I never meant for things to go this far. I was desperate, and I made terrible choices, but I never wanted to hurt Sarah or destroy our family." I studied his face for a long moment, searching for some sign of genuine remorse beneath the fear and desperation. What I saw was a man who was sorry he'd been caught, sorry his schemes had backfired, sorry he faced consequences for his actions. But I saw no evidence that he understood the fundamental violation of trust he'd committed, no recognition of the emotional damage he'd inflicted on people who had welcomed him into their family. "Your apology might have meant something 6 months ago," I told him. "It might have prevented everything that's happened if you'd been honest about your financial problems and asked for help instead of trying to steal what you needed. But you chose deception over honesty, manipulation over communication, theft over trust. The consequences you're facing now are the direct result of choices you made repeatedly over an extended period of time." Harold began gathering the legal documents that would formally initiate criminal and civil proceedings against David. The intervention meeting David had planned as my surrender had become his complete destruction, but more importantly, it had become a demonstration of what happened when someone mistook kindness for weakness and age for vulnerability. As I watched David's world collapse around him, I felt no joy in his downfall, only satisfaction that justice was being served and that other potential victims would be protected from his predatory behavior. The lesson he was learning was expensive, but it was thorough, and it would ensure that he never again underestimated someone based on appearances and assumptions. The game was over, and David had lost more completely than he'd ever imagined possible. The aftermath of David's exposure unfolded with the systematic precision of a well-orchestrated legal operation. Within hours of our confrontation, law enforcement officers arrived to formally arrest him on charges of elder financial abuse, theft, and operating fraudulent investment schemes. As they led him away in handcuffs, David's last glimpse of my home was through the window of a police car, a far different exit than the triumphant departure he'd planned when the day began. Sarah remained in my living room long after the others had left, sitting in stunned silence as she processed the complete destruction of the life she thought she'd been living. The man she'd married, trusted, and defended had systematically lied to her about everything from his professional integrity to his motivations for targeting her father. The intervention she'd participated in wasn't a loving family's attempt to help a declining patriarch, it was a criminal's elaborate scheme to steal from the person who had welcomed him into the family. "Dad," she said finally, her voice broken with exhaustion and grief. "I'm so sorry. I believed everything he told me about your condition, about your need for help. I actually thought I was protecting you by going along with his plans. How could I have been so blind to what he was really doing?" I moved to sit beside her, taking her hands in mine the way I had when she was a child struggling with disappointments that seemed overwhelming at the time. "Sarah, you were manipulated by someone who made deception and manipulation his profession. David didn't just lie to you, he studied you, learned your vulnerabilities, and used your love for me as a weapon against both of us. The fact that you believed him doesn't make you naive, it makes you human." The healing process would take time, but I could see the relief in her eyes as she began to understand that she'd been a victim of David's schemes rather than a willing participant in them. The guilt and confusion that had been consuming her for months started to lift as she realized that her instincts about her father's competence had been correct all along. Michael's reaction was more complex, mixing admiration for his father's financial success with embarrassment about his own willingness to accept David's narrative without question. When he called that evening from his hotel, his voice carried the weight of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions about family, trust, and his own judgment. "Dad, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond this situation with David. I should have questioned his version of events, should have talked to you directly instead of accepting second-hand reports about your condition. I let distance and convenience replace the relationship we should have maintained, and that made it possible for David to manipulate all of us." I told Michael that distance didn't diminish family bonds, that his trust in David's apparent expertise was understandable given the professional credentials David had presented. What mattered now was rebuilding the honest communication that David's manipulation had disrupted, ensuring that our family's future was based on direct relationships rather than filtered through intermediaries with hidden agendas. If you're listening to this story and you're facing a situation where someone in your family has been deceived or manipulated, know that healing is possible when people are willing to acknowledge mistakes and commit to honest communication going forward. Whether it's morning where you are or late at night, remember that families can survive betrayal and emerge stronger when truth replaces deception. Harold's legal team worked with remarkable efficiency to ensure that David's prosecution proceeded quickly and comprehensively. The evidence James Morrison had assembled made David's conviction virtually certain, but more importantly, it provided a foundation for recovering assets he'd stolen from other victims and preventing him from continuing his fraudulent operations. Patricia coordinated with international authorities to freeze accounts David had established in offshore jurisdictions, recovering funds he'd stolen from clients and ensuring that his criminal enterprises were completely dismantled. The scope of David's fraud extended far beyond his attempt to target my assets. He'd been operating a sophisticated network of deception that had victimized dozens of families over several years. The civil lawsuit Harold filed on my behalf served multiple purposes beyond seeking financial damages. It created a public record of David's criminal activities that would protect future victims, established legal precedents for prosecuting elder financial abuse, and sent a clear message that targeting vulnerable individuals would result in consequences far exceeding any potential gains. But the most satisfying outcome was the response from David's other victims, elderly individuals, and their families who had suffered losses but felt powerless to seek justice against someone with David's apparent professional credentials and legal resources. Our evidence and legal action gave them the foundation they needed to pursue their own cases, turning David's systematic predation into the catalyst for his complete destruction. Within 2 weeks of his arrest, David's investment firm was shuttered, his professional licenses were revoked, and his assets were frozen pending resolution of multiple criminal and civil proceedings. The man who had seemed so confident and authoritative during his campaign against me was revealed as a desperate criminal whose apparent success had been built entirely on lies and theft. Sarah filed for divorce immediately, with Harold's assistance ensuring that she was protected from any liability for David's criminal activities. The legal proceedings would be complex, but Sarah's cooperation with law enforcement and her own status as one of David's victims provided strong protection against any attempt to hold her responsible for his crimes. The most poignant moment in the aftermath came when Sarah brought my grandchildren to visit, explaining to them what had really happened and why their stepfather would no longer be part of their lives. The children were confused and hurt, but they were also relieved to understand that their grandfather hadn't been suffering from mental decline and that the strange tension in family gatherings had finally been explained. Eleanor summed up the family's feelings perfectly during one of our evening phone calls. She said that while she was proud of my success and impressed by my handling of David's attack, she was saddest about the fact that such measures had been necessary within our own family. The wealth I'd accumulated over decades of work should have provided security and peace, not become the target for criminal exploitation by someone we'd trusted. As I sat in my study that night, surrounded by the financial documents David had never suspected existed, I reflected on the lessons this experience had taught about trust, family, and the responsibilities that come with success. David had seen my resources as something to be taken, but I understood them as something to be protected and used wisely, whether for defending against threats or building a legacy worthy of the family name. The game David had started was finally over, and justice had been served more completely than even I had initially imagined possible. But more importantly, my family was beginning to heal from the wounds his deception had created, and we were building stronger relationships based on honesty, respect, and direct communication. David's expensive education was complete, but ours was just beginning. 6 months after David's arrest and conviction, I found myself sitting in the same chair where Margaret used to read her mystery novels, but the peace I felt now was different from the quiet contentment I'd known before this ordeal began. It was a deeper peace, born from the knowledge that I had successfully protected not only my own autonomy and dignity but also my family's future from someone who had systematically worked to destroy both. The legal proceedings had concluded with David receiving a substantial prison sentence for elder financial abuse, fraud, and operating illegal investment schemes. The judge had been particularly harsh in his sentencing, noting that David's systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals represented a particularly egregious breach of trust that warranted the maximum penalty allowed by law. David would spend the next decade in federal prison, with additional time possible depending on the outcomes of related cases in other jurisdictions. More importantly, the comprehensive civil judgment had recovered millions of dollars for David's victims while ensuring that he would never again possess the resources necessary to harm other families. The settlement funds had been distributed to elderly individuals and their families who had suffered losses, turning David's predatory behavior into a source of justice and restoration for those he had wronged. Sarah had moved forward with remarkable resilience, rebuilding her life with the support of family who now understood the true nature of what she had endured. Her divorce from David was finalized quickly, with her cooperation in his prosecution earning recognition from law enforcement and protection from any association with his crimes. She had returned to work with renewed focus, channeling her experience into advocacy for elder rights and financial abuse prevention. The relationship between Sarah and me had not only healed but had grown stronger through our shared understanding of how manipulation and deception could damage even the closest family bonds. We talked regularly now, with honest communication replacing the strained interactions that had characterized our visits during David's campaign against me. She often brought the grandchildren for extended visits, and our home had once again become the gathering place for family celebrations and quiet conversations. Michael had taken a leave of absence from his job in Seattle to spend several weeks helping me organize my affairs and understand the full scope of the family's financial situation. Working together on investment strategies and estate planning had given us opportunities to rebuild our relationship while ensuring that the wealth I'd accumulated would serve the family's long-term interests rather than creating new vulnerabilities. For those of you who have listened to this entire story, whether you're starting your day or ending it, whether you're dealing with your own family challenges or simply trying to understand how people can overcome betrayal and deception, know that dignity and self-worth are not determined by age or circumstances. They come from knowing who you are, protecting what matters most, and never allowing others to diminish your value through their assumptions or greed. The most satisfying development had been the establishment of a foundation dedicated to protecting elderly individuals from financial exploitation. Patricia Wong had helped me structure a substantial endowment that would fund legal assistance, educational programs, and investigative resources for families dealing with elder abuse. The Foundation's first major case had been supporting the prosecution of a fraudulent investment advisor who had been targeting retirement communities, using lessons learned from David's case to build an airtight prosecution. Harold Brennan had expanded his practice to specialize in elder law and financial abuse prevention, with our successful prosecution of David serving as a model for other cases involving family manipulation and theft. The legal strategies we'd developed were being shared with law enforcement agencies and legal professionals across the country, helping to build stronger protections for vulnerable individuals who might otherwise suffer in silence. James Morrison had written a comprehensive report about David's criminal network that was being used by regulatory agencies to identify and investigate similar schemes. His documentation methods had become a standard for elder financial abuse cases, providing law enforcement with tools necessary to build successful prosecutions against criminals who targeted age and vulnerability as qualifications for victimhood. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the restoration of trust within my own family. Eleanor and I had grown closer through weekly phone calls that often stretched for hours as we shared memories, discussed current events, and planned family gatherings. The grandchildren had begun asking thoughtful questions about money, responsibility, and the difference between having resources and flaunting them, conversations that gave me hope for their character development and future judgment. On quiet evenings, I often thought about Margaret and what she would have made of this entire experience. She had always been the more suspicious of David's motives, had questioned his sudden interest in my financial affairs and his patronizing attitude toward my independence. I believed she would have been proud of how I'd handled his attack, but more importantly, she would have been pleased that the family had emerged stronger and more united than before. The wealth I'd accumulated over decades of careful work and conservative investment continued to grow under Patricia's expert management, but its purpose had evolved from simple security to active protection and generational legacy. The resources that David had seen as targets for theft had become tools for ensuring that other families would be protected from similar predators and that my own family would have both financial security and the wisdom necessary to manage it responsibly. As I prepared for bed on this peaceful evening, I reflected on the lessons this experience had taught about the true nature of strength, the importance of preparation, and the dangers of underestimating someone based on appearances and assumptions. David had learned these lessons at enormous personal cost, but they had also been valuable reminders for my family about the responsibilities that come with trust and the vigilance required to protect what matters most. The old man David thought he was manipulating had indeed been transformed by this experience, but not in the way he'd intended. I had emerged not as a victim of his schemes but as someone who had successfully defended against sophisticated criminal attack while protecting my family and helping other victims find justice. The assumptions David had made about age and vulnerability had cost him everything, while teaching all of us that wisdom, experience, and careful preparation could triumph over youth, arrogance, and criminal intent. I turned off the lights in my study and walked upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Margaret for so many peaceful years, grateful for the quiet contentment that comes from knowing you've protected what matters most and built something worth passing on to future generations.